Ok. Ok, bienvenue à tous à une conférence très spéciale de Professor Terry Winograd de l'Université de Stanford. So, welcome everyone to a special guest lecture by Professor Terry Winograd of Stanford University. So, this is a part of the class I'm offered this semester on ethics of design and AI and robotics. As you know about Professor Terry Winograd, he's a global respected expert in computer science, social computing, and international development and other fields. And for the one who don't know me, so my name is Chanarong Intashompu. I am adjunct professor at the School of Engineering Design and Teaching Innovation at the Faculty of Engineering at U Ottawa. So before I start this lecture, I would like to invite Professor Daniel Emiot, who is the director of the online master program in digital transformation, to give you everyone a welcome.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for attending this exciting guest lecture. My name is Daniel. I'm a professor in software engineering as well as in digital transformation and innovation, so DTI for short. Many of you are part of this program or belong to another newcomer, namely the Master of Interdisciplinary AI, which we launched last summer. So I'd like to wish a special welcome to the new students of these two programs from the School of Engineering, Design and Teaching Innovation and the Faculty of Engineering. As you know, whether you're working in digital transformations or AI, there are increasingly many ethical concerns that must be taken into consideration. I think that our systems and processes are often social technical in nature, and this now brings interesting challenges during design decisions and also operational decisions while the systems are being used. What is right or wrong has never been blurrier, and people are even polarized by related questions, I would say. Professor Chanarong Intashompu has been very kind taking this initiative of contacting an expert in the field to help us understand some of these challenges and elements of solutions. I may be biased also, but I think that you're lucky to have Chanarong as a professor for this course, which he redesigned with Professor Jason Miller earlier this year. I believe he eats ethics for living, quite frankly. Chanarong already said a few words about Professor Terry Winograd from Stanford University. His contributions range from language understanding to cognition to human-computer interactions, and also the famous PageRank citation algorithm from Google. I think, however, that of closer relevance to the ethics course is Professor Winograd's founding of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, as well as of computer professionals for social responsibility. So he's been heavily involved in the ethics field as well. I also happen to know Professor Hector Levesque from the University of Toronto, who proposed a test of machine intelligence named after him, so the Winograd Schema Challenge, WSC. I'm pretty sure I'm not quite there yet in my own career, unfortunately. So we are privileged to be able to listen to his talk tonight, and I'm eager to acquire knowledge and wisdom from him. And without any further delay, I wish you all a great evening and a great semester.
Yes, thank you, Professor Terry Winograd. Yes, please give your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with a quick procedural question, which is, I'm happy to do it more interactively and take questions as you have them instead of trying to go through the whole thing and then stop for questions. So if I can see you on the screen, you can use the hand raise thing. If you're not visible on the screen, you have to do something because I can't follow the chat while I'm talking. But do feel free to sort of try to get more depth or dig in on something if you want to. I'm also going to take the privilege here of being reflecting my own personal story and course of this. This is not a formal philosophical lecture on the topic. So I'm going to start off with some things from my own history and my own involvement that are relevant to how I think about these problems. And then really toward the end, get into more, how do we think of this in a more abstract way? And what does it make sense to try to do? What's the action side of it? Because in that sense, I'm an engineer, a pragmatist. I mean, I'm not a philosopher who just wants to think about things. I want to figure out what you can do about them. So that's the flavor of it. So I'll just start with my own background. I went into my graduate program in artificial intelligence at MIT back, as I like to say, more than a half century ago. And I was in what was called the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT, directed by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. And my own work was on trying to get the computer to interact with a human being in natural language. And natural language is a term used to mean not a computer language, just the kind of language that we use. We didn't have speech systems back in those days, so it was all typewritten natural language. And I have written books. I can tell you much, much more about AI in those days and what it was happening and so on. But I wanted to make reference to something that was happening that I was only tangential to. At the same time I was doing my dissertation, one of the faculty there was Joseph Weizenbaum. How many of you have heard of Joseph Weizenbaum? Okay, I think my talk is going to be full of you haven't heard of, but right? Joe Weizenbaum was on the faculty at MIT, and he developed a program called ELIZA. You may have heard of the program ELIZA. I won't ask for hands on everything, but and it was the world's first chatbot, to be simplistic about it. It was a program that you typed in what you had to say in English, and it typed back out as though it were a person responding to you. And the most famous use of that was a script he called Doctor, which pretended to be a therapist, emotional therapist. So you would type in something like, I'm feeling sad today. And it would type back out something like, why are you feeling sad today? And anyway, I won't. You can if you look on the internet for Weizenbaum ELIZA, you will find lots of scripts of this kind. But the important thing about it was, and again, we're talking 60 plus years ago, it fooled people into thinking they were talking to a human. Not always, not consistently, but enough people who used it said, wait a minute. There's a famous story where his secretary was using it and said, could you please leave? This is getting too personal. I don't want you to see it. Right. So what it showed is that we as human beings who communicate in language will project that onto even a very pale shadow of what it is that we do. So when you think about what's happening in AI today, it's an important lesson to say he was getting the same results with really primitive technology. I mean, I've had students program the version of it for a class, right? It was not sophisticated, but nevertheless, people responded to it as though it were a person. And that's a natural human tendency that pervades the question of artificial intelligence. How do we evaluate what the machine is actually doing versus what we feel and think it is doing? He wrote a book, and I will send around a reference list. So the things that I mention here, I've got the references online, and I won't try to put them up as I go, but I'll send it around. I'll send it to the professor, and he can send it to you all. But the book was called Computer Power and Human Reason, and the subtitle was From Judgment to Calculation. And his basic argument was that humans are not just doing reasoning in the logical sense, but they are applying judgment. And that judgment was something more than just logic. It had to do with a grounding in human life and in human concerns. I'll quote a little out of review. And Weizenbaum asserts that the definition of tasks and the selection of criteria for their completion is a creative act that relies on human values and cannot come from computers. Weizenbaum makes a crucial distinction between deciding and choosing. Deciding is a computational activity. That's the reason part of it, something that can ultimately be programmed. Choice, however, is the product of judgment, not calculation. So he was arguing, and again, this is it's amazing. It's so relevant to the current discussion of artificial intelligence. And he anticipated this with this very simple example that had been able to program. So I was sort of impressed by two different things. One is how much was being accomplished in the artificial intelligence programming world, and this question of what did it mean in terms of the larger issues of human judgment and human concern. So skipping way ahead, I came to Stanford. I was working on natural language still, and ended up getting into a series of discussions which led me to doubt whether the approach that we were taking to language and reasoning and deciding that he was talking about was actually going to get to something that was like real human language. And I ended up writing a book with a colleague named Fernando Flores, who I still work with. I just had to talk with him yesterday. And we paid attention to what philosophers in sort of out of the fashion areas in this country were dealing with, like phenomenology. How did they think about what it was to be human and what it was to act like a human? And how was that different from logical reasoning and the kind of things that the computers could do? I used to teach, I'm retired now, but I used to teach a whole course on that book and what it meant and how we did it and so on. But to put it very simply, I ended up losing my faith that I was going to really program computers to be like people and moving into the field we call human-computer interaction. So the question isn't how do you make the computer think like a person, but how do you make the computer useful for a person who is thinking? So it was a shift from what some people call artificial intelligence to intelligence augmentation. John Markoff wrote a book. Let me just make a note to myself to put it in the references here. That's one sort of intellectual strand in my life, which is moving through the sort of artificial intelligence, the AI lab, being influenced by Weizenbaum, being influenced by Flores and the philosophy, and going into human-computer interaction, which is how I define the field I'm in and have been for many years now. Second strand has to do with technology and ethics. So going back to those same days in the 60s, again, those of you with long historical memory or knowledge know that that was the period where there was a lot of resistance to the United States war in Vietnam, resistance of various kinds. And one of the obvious questions that was raised was, how is technology playing a role in supporting and prolonging this war? And I joined a group called Computer People for Peace. It actually started in Brooklyn, but ended up having a branch in Boston, and I co-founded the Boston area branch. And it was really looking at how the computer industry in particular, technology industry more broadly, but the computer industry was facilitating the war and the problems it caused. And we had something called the Honeywell project. Honeywell was a computer company in those days. This is before the industry shook out in the way it is now, but the Honeywell computers are one of the major commercial computers in the world. And Honeywell also manufactured cluster munitions. And for those of you familiar with international military law, cluster munitions, basically, instead of it being like a bomb, you drop this thing and then it shoots little metal particles all over and kills anybody who happens to be in the neighborhood. So it's not good for getting rid of buildings or military equipment. It's particularly an anti-human, anti-personnel weapon. And it's been outlawed actually in many international treaties, although they're still produced. So we said, since Honeywell is a computer company, we can use our standing in computing to protest the fact that they're doing this as well. So we weren't arguing about what they were doing with the computers, but it was really that the company as a whole was doing things that we thought were immoral in terms of how you conducted war. And that was sort of the basis. That's when I came out to California, I got engaged in a group which later turned into something called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, which Daniel mentioned in the introduction. We had a long debate about whether it should be computer people or computer professionals. And the decision, which was a very explicitly considered one, was that if we wanted to have an influence with policymakers, the prestige of being professionals made a difference. So we could take advantage of our, and of course, computers in that era were these, we're going to say sacrosanct things, right? Nobody knew what they really were, and nobody had their hands on them. Nobody touched them except for gurus and scientists and stuff. So we were looking at the ways in which computing technology was playing a negative role in policy. And in particular, the program that we really started in a big way with was something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, popularly known as the Star Wars program. This dates us right to an era after the word Star Wars meant something. And the idea was to use computers to control an anti-missile defense, which, to use President Reagan's words, would make nuclear missiles obsolete and impotent. I won't get into all the psychosocial things about why that is an interesting term, but anyway. And we said, look, we're computer people. We've built programs, and we guarantee that if you build a huge, complicated program to do something like shoot down whatever missiles are coming in, no matter how they're coming in, and it has to run correctly the very first time you try it under conditions, because you can't test it by shooting a bunch of missiles, right? It's not going to work. It's a false security. It's not a sensible thing. And we had people who were experts in computer security and computer programming stuff go and actually testify in Congress that this program was sending a lot of money to the defense contractors, which is, of course, what military programs are built for, really. But and it was pulling the wool over the eyes of the public in thinking that it was going to actually prevent nuclear war. And that was an active concern. It sort of died down when the Berlin Wall fell. The two-party Cold War shifted. The idea that the Russians were going to shoot us and we had to defend went away, although it has come back now. It's always interesting how many of these things come back around after decades. And we were looking at other things. We said, okay, well, it was an era, I should point out, when there were a whole bunch of organizations that had social responsibility in their name that were anti-nuclear war. So physicians for social responsibility, psychologists for social responsibility, landscapers for social, everybody wanted to be applying their technical expertise to slowing down the rush towards nuclear war. And so ours was computing. We said, look, there's more to social responsibility than just preventing nuclear war. That's an important thing. We're glad of that. But what about privacy, for example? What about the fact that the FBI is now building national databases that can keep track of citizens in a way which could be used for political control? Is that something that we as socially responsible practitioners of computing want to have a say about? So we develop programs in privacy in other areas. And over time, what happened is these different areas each took on organizations of their own. So nowadays there's EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which does actually have this, one of our directors from CPSR created it, which is looking specifically at issues of privacy. So CPSR is an organization, an umbrella organization, outlived its usefulness as an umbrella, but all of the issues are still there, right? You still need to ask the question, what's ethical and how do you do it? I want to use an example which you are all very familiar with, which is the internet, the web, right? So I looked up some quotes from early on when it was being created. There was a fellow named John Perry Barlow, who part of his fame was having been a songwriter for, I know you probably don't remember this, a rock group called the Grateful Dead, something we old guys knew back when. But he wrote something called the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. This was in the mid 90s. I will just quote a few lines from it. He was a songwriter, right? So he has a certain poetic ring to what he says. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel. I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice, accorded by race, economic power, military force, or a station of birth. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before. Very stirring, right? Is that how the internet turned out? That's a question to pursue, right? Because the ideal was there. The people who were building it really had this feeling that this is going to make the world fair and equitable and all these wonderful things. I looked for a quote from Zuckerberg, and I couldn't find exactly the one I wanted, but he said, when I started Facebook from my dorm room in 2004, the idea that my roommates and I talked about at the time, all the time, was a world that was more open. We believed that people being able to share the information they wanted and having access to the information they wanted is just a better world. People can connect better with the people around them, understand more of what's going on with the people around them, and understand more in general. So I'm using these quotes to illustrate clearly that people who set out to do these kinds of systems often have very noble motives and very idealistic, if naive, views of what they'll do. I now quote from Stephen Levy, who wrote a book about the internet, and it's a critic. He said, the web connects oddballs and fundamentalists, and it gives extremists the feeling that they are part of a broad movement. A rising, seething wave of toxicity is being ridden by unscrupulous politicians. Nobody is happy, especially Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, who endlessly claim they are not qualified to be the world's arbiters of speech. They should have thought of that before they built global platforms based on amplifying the speech of anyone, from pawn to president. And I think that quote really gets to the heart of the question of ethics in technology. How can you anticipate when you build something, whether it's going to fulfill wonderful ideals and whether it's going to lead to, what's the word he used, toxic, rising, seething wave of toxicity. And if you're going to build things, if you're going to, yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested in this idea of amplifying. This I think it's as a very key word in whatever is around cyberspace. It's given a very big power to everyone and amplifying ideas, either positive or negative. And I think that's the most probably critical shift from
Yeah.
a natural world to the cyberspace.
But you can
That of course
be bad
in the world again.
Right. And technology can amplify in whatever direction. Um, so the question is how, and I'll go back to the broad ethics question, how, if you're building, designing, implementing things, do you think about the effects that your tools are going to have on the world? How do you anticipate? And one sort of important philosophical strand that I got from my friend Fernando Flores, I mentioned earlier, is the recognition of the limitation of our ability to plan and predict for the future. Right? Things are going to happen, and it's not like you can't plan for tomorrow, right? At all. But it's arrogant to say, well, here's the world we want. We're going to design it, and it's going to be that way. You can say, here's the world we want. That's great. And you can say, now we're going to go and start building things, and then we're going to learn what really happens. Okay. His metaphor is it's not like planning a trip on, Waze or something. It's like rafting down a whitewater river. You're sort of trying to get somewhere, but what you do at any given moment, you have to be there in the current. You have to be there with what's happening, and you can't predict that ahead of time. So I think one of the messages that comes out of all this is not to have the arrogance to say this is the great world we're going to produce, and then believe that if you just go ahead blindly, you will produce it, because the world is much more complex than that. So there was an author named Shoshana Zuboff, who was at Harvard Business School, wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism. And her basic argument is that things like Facebook and X or Twitter, whatever you call it, and all these things are really based on the idea of finding out what you are interested in and then commercializing that. You are the fuel for these things. You're providing the data, which is about you, and they're selling that to the companies that want to advertise and so on. And that this is again, a complete distortion of the idea of increasing human communication. It's commoditizing human communication. I don't know how many of you have seen this film called The Social Dilemma, done by the Center for Humane Technology. Actually, the main person in it is a former student of mine from Stanford, Tristan Harris. And it's just a very graphic presentation of surveillance capitalism at work. I mean, to put it in overly simple terms, right? It's how the way we interact with each other in the world gets distorted by going through the which is not the megaphone, although megaphone is a good example here, but the technology that's being built. All right, let me move on to a related topic, which is what's happening in AI nowadays. And the first thing that I will point out is that it's a totally different thing than it was when I was in the AI lab 60 years ago, right? That is, we were doing something which was based on a set of assumptions about rational reasoning and logic and representation. That guy named John Hoagland, a philosopher, called it good old-fashioned AI. That was his term for it. And there were very primitive versions of things like neural nets, but really primitive and problematic. What's going on today uses a completely different model. So if you say, what's the representation of knowledge in this computer, in this system for the AI system, the answer is it doesn't have a representation of knowledge. It has lots of data about what words follow what others in trillions of bytes of input data it has. It's what somebody called a stochastic parrot. All it can do is parrot back, but it can do it based on the probabilities of many, many things, not on just one word for one word. It wasn't as simple as a Weizenbaum's program. Now, I was, to be honest, surprised as anyone about how successful they could be. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would say, yeah, it's an interesting technology, but it's never going to do much. Well, it does a lot. What it does is interesting to try to understand what it does and what it doesn't do. And I have a friend, Brian Smith, who actually was a student of Weizenbaum's. Everything ties back together, right, at MIT. He wrote a book called The Promise of Artificial Intelligence a few years ago. And what he said is, so this is with the new artificial intelligence, not the good old-fashioned kind. I am not worried about whether AI systems will grow more powerful than we humans or that they will develop their own consciousness. Two things do terrify me, though. One is that we will rely on reckoning systems in situations that require genuine judgment. This harks back to the distinction that Weizenbaum made. And two, that by unduly impressed by reckoning prowess, we will shift our expectations on human mental activity in a reckoning direction. So not only do we get overly imbued with what the computers are able to do in this non-thinking, let me call it, way, but we will accept that as the standard for what we want from other people. And there's, well, let me jump ahead in my notes here, but because there was this philosopher Hoagland, who I mentioned, who came up with GoFi, is famous. His statement that he made is, the trouble with artificial intelligence is the computers don't give a damn. And I think that's clever and also very deep. That is, when I go to a computer LLM, a language model, and it gives me an answer, does it care whether it gave me the right answer or not? What would it even mean for it to care? Care isn't there. It gives an answer based on its algorithm, and that's what it does, period. It doesn't give a damn about what that answer is or what effect it has or how it fits in or anything. By nature, it's not like it's just that they haven't put that in yet. It's a totally different way of approaching the world. It's what Weizenbaum called judgment as opposed to reckoning, right? Now, why do you care? I mean, so AI systems are being used for lots of interesting things. There are a lot of areas where you do care, and there's been a big movement of concern, and this goes back to the CPSR days, really, of autonomous weapons. What happens if you take this notion that the result that comes out of the machine can be implemented without human intervention, right? You don't need a person to do it. And I found a quote by a guy named Paul Scharr, who was a military guy. He's at the Center for New American Security. And he tells a story which I think has an interesting resonance. He recounted one mission that sent him to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to look for Taliban fighters. There, his team spotted a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with a herd of goats circling their position. They soon realized the animals were a ruse, and the child was, in fact, reporting their location to Taliban officials by radio. Rules of war would have labeled her an enemy combatant that would have allowed Scharr's team to shoot. But for Scharr and his team, shooting the child was not an option. It would have been the wrong thing to do, he said. But if an artificially intelligent robot had been in Scharr's place instead, he believes the outcome would have been different. Had the robot been programmed to comply with the rules of war, the little girl would have been fired at, he said. Scharr said this raised a question. How would you design a robot to know the difference between what is legal and what is right? And how would you even begin to write down those rules ahead of time? What if you didn't have a human there to interpret these, to bring that whole set of human values to those decisions? So the military is just a kind of egregious example because the consequences are so immediate and dire. But the general message is when a computer is making some kind of decision, let me use the word decision, when is that not enough? When is something that's underlying human need to be there? There are many issues, and I'm not going to use the time here to go into them at length, where computers do make decisions that have effects on humans. Another area that's been very, I mentioned the CPSR program on the FBI database many, many years ago, but the whole surveillance question is huge. What if you have technologies, including facial recognition and voice recognition and lots of other things that could tell somebody who's surveilling, whether You can decide the government or other parties, other governments, whatever, who's doing what, when, where, and keeping tabs on them. And I think there's a whole set of complex issues that I'm not qualified to really get into about who should be able to be surveilled for what purposes. I mean, if you go to China, there's a very different attitude by the government, which many people here would object to in the US or Canada. So there are many issues of which military is, as I said, just one egregious example where we need to take a step back and say, well, what is the computer able to do, and what are we enabling it to do? What are we entitling it to do by building AI systems? So I'm going to stop on this track and go back to what I thought of as my third track, which is how do you think about ethics? I started a course back in the early CPSR days, a few decades ago, with a colleague from philosophy named Helen Nissenbaum. And it was a course on computers, ethics, and social responsibility. And the question we were asking the students to consider is, what are your ethical responsibilities as the people who are going to be building new technologies? One of the things we used in that course, which I thought was really effective, was a documentary film about Oppenheimer. It's not the current Oppenheimer film, but it's called The Day After Trinity by John Else. And it was a set of interviews and historical footage of the people who worked on the atom bomb project in Los Alamos. And the mental agony that they had after the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. That up until then, it was very much a technical problem. How do we solve a million engineering? And it was a brilliant physics and engineering project. And to get this thing to actually ignite. And it worked. Trinity was the name of the first test. So the day after Trinity is pointing to what did they think when they saw this thing actually go off? And then what did they think when they saw it dropped on people and killing hundreds of thousands in one boom? And it raises the question, should they have not done it? Should they have done it differently? Should they have? And what they realized, of course, is that in the end, they built it, but they didn't have control over who used it when it got dropped. They could give advice, but they're scientists, not politicians, not generals. So you can't say, well, I'm going to build it and then I'll decide what it should be used for. I'm going to build it, and then the people who have more power in these things are going to decide what it's used for. And how do I deal with that? So we fortunately have not had anything in the computer field quite as dramatic as Hiroshima, but the same issue is there. The same issue is there when, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to make everything more transparent and ended up facilitating the crazies, right? If you want to put it in simple terms. So how do you think about ethics? And in this course that I mentioned with Helen, we taught ethical theory, which I see in your syllabus. You've had, utilitarianism and deontological ethics and this classical philosophical views of that. But the next question is, okay, you can argue those, philosophers do endlessly. What is it like in life to make ethical decisions? And it's not like if you simply decide, okay, I believe in utilitarianism, I can put in the variables and it will crank out the answer, build this or don't build that. For the reason I said before, you have almost no ability to predict the future. If you say, if we build it, here's the utility, going back to straight utilitarian arguments, that's going to have, then you're just guessing. And you could be guessing 100% wrong, 180 degrees wrong, right? You just don't know. So to say you're going to end up making your ethical decisions based on that calculation is unrealistic. But if you say we're going to base it on general principles, the Kantian imperative or whatever it is. Then you have the question of, yes, they're easy to state in the abstract and almost impossible to say when they do and don't apply in real life. They're very good abstractions, but in this particular case, what am I actually, is this a violation of human rights or not? And as you know from current news, what does or doesn't constitute a violation of human rights is a hugely contested area, independent of what your philosophical grounding is, right? It's, what are we doing? So my view, and I wrote a paper on this, which I'll put in the references, is that you can't think of ethics as a way to give you decisions, but that being an ethical practitioner in some field like computing is a matter of being in dialogue with the community of practitioners about how they see things happening and what they think is possible and what they think is right. So it's a community-based, not an individualistic, logic-based process. Ethics is a process, not an answer, not a result. Now, who makes ethical decisions? And it's important not to get into a kind of individualistic moral view which doesn't recognize issues of power, issues of politics, issues of all those things that go on. So governments end up making lots of decisions. You can argue them, you can vote, you can do whatever you do to affect governments. You can't just tell them to go get lost like Barlow did. But what role as an individual do you have in that? Corporations, and this has been one of the huge discussions about the future of artificial intelligence, which is most of the decisions that are getting made today are not being made by governments or commissions or all these things you see, but by OpenAI and Google and Meta, whoever it is that's building them. And they're going to make the decisions they make based on their own goals in being in the world, which ultimately is profit, to be honest. I mean, sometimes there's a sense of responsibility, but ultimately the responsibility is to the shareholders, as they say. What role do employees have in a company? I mean, Google is an interesting example. Some of you may have heard of Project Maven. Project Maven was a Google research and development project to use computer AI vision to help drones recognize targets on the ground. Sponsored by the Air Force or the Army, whoever it was who was sponsoring military. And the employees protested. They said, we think this AI technology is great, but we do not want it to be used for weapons building. And there were visible, external protests. And in the end, Google did stop that particular project. It was causing too much friction with their own employees. Now, they did not stop having military contracts altogether. They did not stop necessarily every other project of that kind. So it's hard to say that this solved the problem, if you think of problem solving. But nevertheless, it was one way that people who work in a company can express their views. And a lot of you may have seen the fuss about Google's AI ethics committee and people who worked there and then left and said that AI systems were inherently biased and they shouldn't do them and so on. And I believe, again, if I'm talking to people who are going to be in the industry, it makes sense to think about that and to try to have activism and to recognize the limitations on what you can achieve in the larger structure of what a company is trying to do. You have to work within that. Academic scientists. You can make the simple case which says, well, we don't build things, we just come up with ideas, so it's not our fault. Even if our idea was the atom bomb, right? Sort of. Going back to the Strategic Defense Initiative that I mentioned earlier with CPSR, I wrote a paper about it and I was passing it around to my colleagues in computer science. And one of them said, Well, you may think that I have the morals of a styrofoam cup, but, and then he went on to give the excuses for why he was going to work on it anyway. Yes, he agreed that it did not actually make things safer. It didn't do what it said, but, and there are a lot of good reasons people give, or rationalizations, let me say. Well, if I don't do it, somebody else will. That's the biggest one. Because why should I? If they won't even be in there to watch out for problems, whereas I'm being very responsible as I do it, so I'll take the money and do the research, and so on. So even in academic situations, there is the question of where is your work going to go? Knowing that you cannot, again, no arrogance of saying I can tell you for sure is what's going to happen, but trying to anticipate what could go right and what could go wrong and think about how to deal with those consequences. I'll go back to Joe Weizenbaum, who's predicting all these bad things that will happen with AI, of it taking over judgment and so on. He says, I cannot tell why the spokesmen I have cited want the developments I forecast to become true. Some of them have told me that they work on them for the morally bankrupt reason that if we don't do it, somebody else will. I mentioned that. Others reveal they have abdicated their autonomy by appealing to the principle of technological inevitability. It's going to happen. So why should I try to resist? And then what he says is finally, all I can say with assurance is that these people are not stupid. All the rest is mystery. All right. So how does your moral thinking affect what you do in life? And I'll just one more quote to finish off that thought. It is a widely held but grievously mistaken belief that civil courage finds exercise only in the context of world-shaking events. To the contrary, its most arduous exercises is often in those small contexts in which the challenge is to overcome the fears induced by petty concerns over career, over our relationships to those who appear to have power over us, over whatever may disturb the tranquility of our mundane existence. And I think that's, if you say, what's the bottom line message on ethics, is to keep that in mind, not to say, oh, well, it's too big, I can't stop it, I can't, yes, that's all probably true in some sense. But in every, where do you take a job? Where do you not take a job? What kind of questions do you ask the people you work with, the people who are your bosses? What kind of questions are going to disturb the tranquility too much? I mean, that's real, right? I mean, you can't ask ethical questions of somebody who's simply dedicated to getting something going down the track. You're slowing them down. So I wish I had, what's the right word? A golden set of principles which said, here's what you do, and then you'll be ethical. I don't, right? What you have to do is keep thinking about it and talking to people about it, and being aware that these are all very intertwined issues. All right, I'm going to stop there and go into discussion, questions, whatever. And let's see, I think I may, now that I'm slowed down, may be able to put an eye on the chat.
I saw a few hands before during the talk, and I saw Muhammad has a hand and Professor Daniel.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention about Oppenheimer and the technology that they discovered. Everyone was happy, everyone was thrilled about this. And right at the other side of the ocean, Heisenberg was working on the same project, and both were doing the same thing, but with different motives, and probably would have been ended in some other ways. So I really wanted to know your thoughts on this.
Well, most of the German physicists did not want Hitler to have the atom bomb. There may have been, I don't know about Heisenberg in particular, but the general feeling was, so they were dragging their feet. They were not pushing forward on it because they felt that would be bad for the world. What's interesting is, and if you talk to the American scientists, they were motivated very much by Germany and Hitler and the Nazis. And once the Nazis surrendered, I'm talking about April 1945, Some of them said we should stop working on this. We don't need it to stop the Nazis. It's going to be unpredictable in what it does. We should stop. And there was no traction in that. There were a few people who talked about that, but the project was so big and so far underway that there was no way of saying, oh, wait a minute. Right. Instead, they said, well, we'll do it and then justify it in terms of what we can do to the Japanese. But the Japanese were never the real target of the scientists who worked on it.
I think there was also the Soviet threat, right? Because the Soviet army was likely also after the technology. So one war ended, the other one started.
Yeah, no, I think that was another part of it, which of course, if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, which you should, you see a lot of the ramifications of all this, but that there were people, Cold Warriors, to call them that, who said, we need the bomb and we need to drop it to show the world what it does in order to try to fight back against the power of the Russians. Now, at the same time, there were people who were turning over the secrets to the Russians. So it's, as always, you cannot control.
Next, Patricia, and then Nick.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to listen and to be able to ask a few questions about your thoughts. I guess I kind of wanna. It's a question about two kind of different things. So for instance, I'm originally from Mexico. It is generally known that in a country like mine, we talk about governments not making enough decisions about what's happening with technology, right? And in a country like Mexico, where there's much corruption, and interests of the governments are driven by corporations, how can we influence what society in these countries are able to, I guess, protest against, and also considering that many times in countries like Mexico or, what they call third world countries, the access to technology and to, resources of understanding the implications of technology can be very limited by education and so on. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on these, right? How do we bring balance to what Western countries, the countries that are driving AI are doing and their measures to try to kind of avoid big impacts, versus countries that are, not only learning about what technology can achieve, but also they're also battling the difficulties with the government actually doing what they're supposed to do and protecting people's interests.
Well, let me just echo what Mohammed said early on, which is technology is an amplifier, it's not a cause. So problems aren't caused by technology. They're caused by people. They're caused by political systems. They're caused by all sorts of things that are human. And they can be amplified by technology.
Mhm.
So your question is unfortunately one that's not going to be answered in the technological sphere. I mean, you can pick individual cases where, like, autonomous weapons and stuff, but in general, the larger problems have to be dealt with, and that's not going to be fixed by giving everybody a Facebook account, right? I mean, so it's a political question. I mean, I can give my own political opinions on revolution or whatever, but it's not something that's is driven by the technology. There was a quote, I was going to use this earlier, I think I forgot. Did I give the quote from the bumper sticker from Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility?
Not yet.
Technology is driving the future. It's up to us to steer.
Mm.
All right. So it can drive, it's the motor, but somebody is steering.
Next.
Yeah, I'm a little
curious about your thoughts. You mentioned Zuckerberg and Dorsey starting out with noble goals. Google removed "Don't be evil" from their code of conduct. So there's maybe some kind of shift in corporate values that happens over time. What do you think is the catalyst there? Is it maybe capitalism, complexity? Maybe they never really embodied those values in the first place.
Well, I mean, the answer, of course, is all of the above. But I think trying to understand the sincerity of people who had those values is hard. It's psychological analysis, and I don't need to doubt them. I mean, I'm willing to believe that they really thought this was going to be just good for everybody. What are the imperatives of a large company? And the answer is it's a company. I mean, capitalism is there, right? So in the end, I think why Google ended up with the dropping the "Don't be evil" motto and so on has a lot to do with just growth. Both growth in the sense of just the number of people, the number of the disconnect. I mean, back when I was connected to Google directly, which I haven't been for many, many years, you knew the people. It was a small group. You could get together. You could think about these things in a more human way. When you've got 50,000 employees or whatever it is, and they're spread around the world and all that, you end up becoming a company and becoming a big company and doing what big companies do, which is not driven by morals, not driven by being immoral. I'm not saying the opposite, but is driven by the imperatives of growth and income. And as long as your overall system is rewarding that, it's very hard to change it. I mean, now how do you get beyond capitalism? That's a good question, because obviously communism as it was tried out did not work for that. But something which values what's good for the community more than just what's good for the company, I think we have to figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
And I will just say, our image here as Canada does a better job at that than we do.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you.
Well, even in Canada, there is room for improvement, I'm afraid. Thank you, Terry, for the nice talk. One comment and one question. I think you underlined the role of individuals in actions as well. There's a nice quote, which is the title of a book from about 20 years ago. In French, the book is called Acheter, c'est voter, but it means essentially to buy is to vote. And this reminds me essentially of actions that have impact as well on the community. So it's not all about money. I guess my question though is related to the justification, right, of action based on, well, if we don't do it, others will do it, so might as well do it first. When is there a way to detect when something like this actually does become a race and whether that race is unstoppable? So we've faced it with the atomic bomb. We're facing it right now with the new generation of AI system. So in your experience, is there a way to detect this? Is there a way to prevent this before it becomes too late?
It's a good question, and it ups the ante on my thing about community, which is there a world community? I mean, if you treat the world as a set of independent national state actors who are doing things for their own good at the expense of the others, then this kind of race condition has to happen. If there's something that's going to be increasing your power, if it increases somebody else's power, that decreases your power. So this zero-sum game where we have to be on top compared to others naturally leads into those kinds of races. Now, is there some notion of a world collective which isn't zero-sum game, which is win-win, to use the jargon, right? I wish I had a political party which could answer that, but it's certainly danger not to have it.
It's not just about nations, right? So we have all those other ways of dividing the world, I guess. I mean, we see it in the corporate world, right? So between companies,
yep,
and they are not nations, although sometimes they do have the financial means of nations nowadays. So there is no hope from your answer.
I don't think there's an what's the right word? It's a simple incremental hope that we just need to do this and it'll fix it. There, who could have predicted 2,000 years ago what the current political situation in the world's going to be now? The answer is you couldn't, right? You knew about empires, you knew about horse brigades, you knew about whatever, but the world changes and communication is a technology which changes things more rapidly. I think it's a big megaphone, right? It's a big amplifier. Communication technologies of all sorts, but things like the internet being, of course, the current example. If you say, what's the world going to be like 2,000 years from now? First of all, will it still exist? I mean, that's another set of questions. We haven't even talked about climate here. But will we have moved to some other system and look back on, we, of course, being collective, not me, look back on the world of nations that we have today as an interesting, quaint thing, like we look back at the Persian Empire as a kind of quaint thing. I mean, who knows?
Okay,
Next
thank you.
question is from Muhammad Alberini.
Thank you. Probably a philosophical one, but I'm just thinking of, as we understand, probably not accept, but understand that some human could be less ethical than others. Can we imagine that? I mean, why are we expecting that all the technology product or AI should be all ethical? Couldn't we manage a future where not necessarily all the AI or whatever are not ethical?
Well, let me start with a question about the framing of that, which is I don't think AI systems are or can be ethical. The applications can be done in an ethical way. And so it's back to, again, the Weizenbaum message. It's not the machine that's ethical or unethical. It's how you choose to use it and what you accept as appropriate and not appropriate and so on. Now, what does it mean to say there would be applications of AI which are in some inherent sense not ethical? Let's pick an obvious one, deep fakes. Right. So I have the ability, as you all do now, if you go on the right app, to make a video of somebody saying whatever you want them to, whether they would want to say it or not, and then to distribute that so that the world thinks they said it. Is that unethical inherently, or is it the way that we use it that's being unethical? Should we simply outlaw it? Because if it is, if you say, what do we outlaw? The ability to make any kind of a fake? I mean, it's a very hard question if you try to make the technology the center of it. If you say, what are the applications? We can all say it's unethical to put out a campaign ad with your opponent saying things that they didn't say, right? That has to do with opponents and campaigns and a whole world of stuff that's not just the technology. So I think we're going to live with, as I say, dual use, right? I mean, guns are dual use, right? Is a gun unethical? Guns don't kill people, right? Well, it's an interesting question, right? But if you look at the way guns are being used and thought about in this country, and again, Canada's ahead of us, but you could argue that they should just be abolished altogether, or you could say, no, they're necessary for hunting or for policing or whatever it is that they're being used for. It's not the gun the gun isn't the center of the ethical question. It's the use of it. Who has the right to shoot it at whom?
Thank you. So I have two things to say, and often.
Sorry,
Okay.
I have a follow-up because I think this is too easy to say, that part, right? So, or we can build something and it's really up to people to use it wisely afterwards. And that's the thing I see with guns as well, right? So guns kill, but actually they do. That's their purpose. So I guess my question here is how do we detect situations where the tool, a technology that we're developing, we know it's going to be used for a very bad purpose, or we're opening essentially a Pandora box.
Yeah, no, it's a spectrum. I mean,
how do we prevent that without, premature censorship or getting in the way of the good applications as well?
Right. I mean, let me go back to my example from the Honeywell Corporation. Cluster bombs don't have a lot of what you would consider as beneficial applications. I mean, you could make up a story about using them for clearing a field or something, right? I don't know what, but realistically, the fact they're built has to do with the use that we don't want. Now, that's only true of a certain subset of technologies where you can really pin them very closely to what they're going to be used for. Guns are sort of an intermediate case, right? Cars kill people, right? But we don't think of cars as being unethical because they kill people. I mean, they do a lot of other things, and that's just part of it. So I think it has to be a case by case contextualized understanding of that, not can we just say this is a bad, this is a good. Gunati, you had a question earlier.
Yeah, so I wanted to respond to Mohammed because he asked the question about ethical, can we have some ethical technologies and it's okay, and agreed it's a spectrum, but the other portion of that is we actually do know that AI amplifies more than a human. So right now, it's human beings carrying a bunch of guns around, and there's a limited impact for each individual act of gun violence. Whereas that is not the case with these large language models or whatever we're putting out on social networks, on the internet and that. So therefore, having just a little bit of ethics or, bad ethical players or whatever it's a different calculus, I think. Now, my other comment actually was it has to do with the overall, we've quoted Oppenheimer and the whole nuclear arms race and, just building the atomic bomb to begin with and that. And we're having these discussions about the large language models and potential AGI, going into AGI and all of that. But I've been looking at it for the past few years of two aspects of history. Number one, the atomic bomb was only used twice by one player. And even today, with all of Putin's saber rattling, nobody has deployed an atomic bomb. So there's something inherent in humanity as a whole, even the so-called bad players, etc., that's holding us back. And the second one is designer babies. And even in China, which when one of their scientists went and did the designer baby thing, even the Chinese go, the people that we demonize on the other side, there's something universal happening here where certain points are not crossed because even the players who seem to be irrational are taking a step back. And I guess for me, that's a little bit hopeful with respect to these technologies and the fact that we're having these discussions at the dawn of ChatGPT and Claude and, all of the others right now. So that was just
a good question. And I think, designer babies are a great example, again, of technologies which are not inherently, it's how they're used. I mean, if you said it's only going to be used to get rid of serious congenital diseases and in a way which doesn't cause, fetuses to get killed when they shouldn't, whatever, you would say, well, it is a good idea to be able to get rid of that bad gene, right? Now, once you start doing it, though, of course, there's a slippery slope. I mean, it can be used for everything from, choosing the sex of your child to building the Ubermensch or whatever it is. And I think we have to live in a world where we're on that uncertainty edge. We don't know how it will be used. And often the answer is don't try, right? Because then for sure it won't get used for the things you don't want. And the argument against that is it has enough importantly good uses that you don't want to just not try it at all. And then how do you weigh those against each other? And AI is certainly in that field. One of the things I didn't talk about, and I'm surprised somebody hasn't called me on it, is there a danger of AGI?
Mm.
Right? I mean, are we setting ourselves up so that some number of years from now, our descendants will be faced with the computer overlords who basically tell them what they have to do because the computer is smarter than the people. I don't think that's an inevitable technological development. I mean, to go back to that question of technology is driving the future, right? I think, and I also don't think it's close. I mean, I think the ways in which they're smart now are not close yet. And I'll put in the yet there because I don't know to what you would think of as, quote, truly intelligent.
I saw a hand up from Muhammad Saki.
Yeah. So I'm really happy you touched on this point where in the future, technology will tell our descendants what to do. But yeah, you mentioned that it might be kind of impossible in some ways. But how about technology gives the power to a group of people, which nowadays we call them as influencers, to change the way people think, decide, and live?
Yep. No, I think that's the real question. I mean, that quote I gave from for Brian Cantwell Smith again is it's how will it get used to not control, but shape what we do with other people.
Anuti, you have more to say?
Yeah, well, okay, this AGI question, and it's an offshoot of that one, which is I'm looking at ChatGPT right now, and I'm reading up a lot of articles of what it does well and what it doesn't do well. And one of the things that comes up is people are having conversations with this entity. I'm trying not to anthropomorphize this thing, but it's happening. Okay, forgive my words here. So people are conversing with it, and what seems to, for lack of a better word, seduce a lot of people into believing this thing is getting us closer and closer to AGI is the context. Okay, so it seems to give us a sense that it's understanding and giving us answers within the context of what we're doing, and there's a back and forth. And when humans connect with each other, we do have context and we bring that to the table. And yet, even though it has this capability of contextualizing the conversation and the content of the conversation, giving us the impression that it's semantics is happening here. It's not just a syntactical thing. Yet, the biggest gap right now is how it misinterprets references. And it just presents references in the wrong way, or it misquotes, or it even creates references that didn't exist by amalgamating 2 or 3 different papers and stuff like that. How is that happening? How is it able to do this context thing when it's conversing with you, and yet it's not able to understand what it's bringing to the table, with respect to references? Like, that boggles my mind. How is it able to do context, or are we all being fooled by the context that it's giving us a sense of?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I have a simple answer, but I think it is that it's what appears to be context. I mean, going back to Eliza, right? I mean, one of the tricks that Weissenbaum put into it is if you mention something, it would store away that, and somewhere later in the conversation, it would say, earlier you said, and then quote what you had said earlier in the conversation. No understanding of why, or no depth, and people said, wow, it really has context. It really remembers that I said something about that. So it's easy for people to read into systems more than they're actually doing. And to go back to the Hoagland statement, right? The computer doesn't give a damn. It doesn't care, right? It's just more words.
More question from Mohammed, a comment?
Yeah, just adding a comment that to Onati and the professor, that we're living in a generation that does the majority care about the reference? I mean, that can be a question.
Well, I think the reference is just a symptom. I mean, you must have read the news stories about, I've now forgotten exactly what this AI system told you to put on your pizza. Something completely inedible, whatever it was, or
Glue. I think it told it to put glue on.
Glue, yeah.
glue. That was it.
Yeah.
Glue on your pizza. Or is that how many rocks should I eat every day? And it gave a number. I mean, so I think the fact that references aren't real is just part of the same thing, that it doesn't have real facts that it's dealing with. It's just copying out from the context.
It's about trust. When I say references, I don't just mean in the scholarly sense of references.
Right.
I'm saying there's something about you have to trust the person that's talking. Okay, you have to have faith and belief that you're on the same wavelength. You have to bring to the table eyewitness accounts where you trust the speaker itself. So that's when I'm talking references, I'm talking all of that aspect of it.
Yeah. No, trust
Not
is
just writing an essay.
trust is at the heart of it, and it's trust doesn't mean you think that everything they say is right. People you trust completely can tell you things that are just completely wrong, right? They can make up references, but you think they're not. If they made it up, they know they're making it up, right? It's not like you trust them not to consciously or explicitly try to mislead you, as opposed to that wise, because they care and they give a damn. They care about your relationship.
It's like often I get a question from my student in my class. So give me the best practices or step to do ethical AI. And often I say to them the same thing. I don't have specific step.
Yeah.
But the point being in this class is I say the first week when we go through syllabus, this is what you need to learn and what you can gain from it. But only my point to engineering student is from this class, I'm already happy if they take this class and when they go back to work and think about it, what they do, the impact, what they can have on the AI development or the use of it, and thinking about this class for 3 seconds, I think I done my job. That's all I expected.
Absolutely. You can't get people answers, you can get them
No.
to thinking.
Yeah. And then what you say when you say talking about how we need to communicate, talk together about the practice, what we do in AI practice actually is one of my ongoing project where I talking about different country. We do in Canada and Norway, and now I'm going to the poor country. We talk with AI technologists and policy maker and also the user from the underserved community, talking about what they think about certain ethical aspect like privacy or trust or bias that the use of AI could have, and then present it to the maybe engineering principle or thing that need to care of in the future. Yeah. But it's really what you said to me this week, this lecture is really give me a boot up that I heading to the right direction.
Yes, great.
Yeah. Thank you. Any more questions for this special guest lecture?
Yeah, just one more question for myself. First of all, thank you for the presentation. This has been a great talk. The questions, answers, everything's been amazing. One of the questions that I have kind of goes back to one of the readings that we had earlier in the semester around why technology favors tyranny. And so a lot of this was around how we think about democracy and dictatorship and the conflict there, and how we think of it as between ethical systems, but it's actually around data processing systems. So, and the centralization of power and allowing faster action. And so I'm wondering, how does a democracy remain relevant over the long term, accepting that there's an inevitability to how other governance systems and nations will use AI? And AI is exploding faster than I think probably any of us ever anticipated. And I'm thinking back to what you said earlier in the lecture around how, if I don't do it, somebody else will, right? And so we know that there are these a dictatorship. Other governance systems are going to use AI however they want, right? And they may use it in ways and faster that without thinking about or considering or even caring about the ethical considerations that we might think of in Canada or the US. And so how do we remain relevant? Because there's probably a quick pathway, and when I think about it, to how certain countries will use this just for their own ends without thinking about any sort of greater good. So anyway, yeah, interested in your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm not a political optimist in the sense that I can say, oh no,
Right.
the democracy will win out. I wish. But I mean, and the answer to how do we deal with it is having to deal with it on a case by case basis and try to counter it. I mean, you can't stop it as a whole, but if you say, okay, Russia is using AI to affect the US election, how do we counter that? And how do we reveal it and all those kinds of things?
Muhammad, Saki?
Yeah, so since we're talking about this evolving time that we're living in, do you think that it's good to start implementing education aspects of this generative AI into early stages for students, like let's say K-12, to just know, to be educated, to make better decisions and be more ethical of using it?
Yeah, I mean, when you first said using it in education, I was thinking of people who were saying we should use it to teach all the subjects, right? You're not saying it, you're saying educating about what AI is and about what it does. And I'm at heart an educator. I mean, that's what seems to me like the only hope for getting things to change is getting people to understand it.
I think that's why this class I teach is one of the compulsory class in our program, because try to people understand about what their ethical implication of the whole thing is. And it have been 8:23. I just remind all the participants, all the record here will be recorded and posted on my YouTube channel, where I interview and talk with different AI expert, and it's contributing to the open education for the world, not only our university or only for our group. So when it's posted, I will let you know. But
Great.
thank you so much, Professor Terry Winograd, and I hope to see you in person soon again, even in the Bay.
Invited.
And I hope you can come back to give a special lecture like this to our student again in the future.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
so
Thank
much.
you.
thank
Thank
you
you.
everyone
Thank
for your
you.
participation.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.